September 21, 1327. The cold stone walls of Berkeley Castle in England silently witness one of the most brutal murders in the history of European monarchy. A 43-year-old man with a graying beard and eyes that no longer carry the brightness of yesteryear lies on an improvised bed in one of the cells. His wrists and ankles show deep marks from chains. His face is marked by humiliation and suffering. This man, born to the purple and educated to govern an empire, is now nothing more than a forgotten prisoner. His name is Edward I Plantagenet. Until a few months ago, King of England. In the middle of the night, two men enter his cell. They bring with them a medieval instrument of torture, a red-hot iron. What follows is a murder so horrible, so symbolically cruel, that it will echo through the centuries. The deposed king is immobilized, and a horn tube is inserted into his anus. Through this tube, the red-hot iron is introduced, burning his internal organs without leaving visible external marks. His screams are muffled by pillows. The next morning, the former king's body is found lifeless, his face contorted in a final mask of unbearable agony. The official cause of death, natural causes. This is the most well-known, most dramatized, and most shocking version of Edward I's death. A story that has become almost legendary and evokes the supreme horror of a tyrant being punished in a way that reflected his supposed sins in this case, his alleged homosexual relationships. But is this what really happened that night in Berkeley? To understand this historical enigma, we need to go back in time and explore the complex and tragic life of this controversial monarch. Edward was born on April 25, 1284, in Caernarfon, Wales, the fourth surviving son of the feared King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, and Eleanor of Castile. He became heir to the throne after the death of his older brothers. From an early age, it was clear that the young prince had little in common with his warrior father. While Edward I was a formidable military leader and a calculating statesman, his son preferred activities considered inappropriate for royalty, swimming, rowing, crafts, and the company of people from lower classes. Some chronicles mention that he enjoyed peasant work digging ditches, repairing roofs, and forging metals. This rejection of chivalric ideals by the son enraged Edward I. Accounts of the time describe how, in a fit of rage, the king tore out handfuls of his son's hair because he had requested a title for his favorite friend, Piers Gaveston. This young nobleman from Gascony had entered the royal household as the prince's companion, but soon became much more than that. The relationship between Edward and Gaveston would become the epicenter of problems that would eventually lead to the future king's downfall and death. When Edward I died in 1307, his son, at 23 years of age, ascended to the throne as Edward III. One of his first acts was to recall Gaveston, whom his father had exiled, and grant him the powerful title of Earl of Cornwall, normally reserved for members of the royal family. Worse still, in the eyes of the nobility, the new king gave Gaveston the royal treasures he had inherited and allowed him to carry St. Edward's crown during the coronation ceremony, an unheard-of privilege for someone outside the royal family. The exact nature of the relationship between Edward I and Gaveston has been a subject of debate among historians for centuries. Contemporary chroniclers used ambiguous terms, describing how the king loved him beyond all measure and that he had formed with him a covenant of constancy, binding himself with a bond of indissoluble love. Some historians argue that this language simply reflected the chivalric ideals of strong male friendship. Others, however, point out that later chroniclers were more explicit, with a bishop in 1334 accusing the late Edward of sodomy, a medieval term for homosexual relations. Regardless of the exact nature of their relationship, Edward's behavior with Gaveston was politically disastrous. In 1308, the king married Isabella of France, daughter of the powerful King Philip IV, in a standard diplomatic arrangement for the time. During the wedding festivities, however, Edward devoted all his attention to Gaveston, completely ignoring his new wife. Worse still, according to accounts of the time, the jewels that Edward had given to Isabella as a wedding gift ended up in Gaveston's hands. The humiliations suffered by the Queen, who was only 12 years old at the time, would never be forgotten. The English nobility, led by the king's cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward yielded, only to bring him back shortly afterward. This cycle repeated several times until, in 1312, the barons captured Gaveston and summarily executed him, stabbing and beheading him at the edge of a road. Edward, devastated, swore vengeance, but was forced into a temporary reconciliation with the noble assassins. Edward's reign was marked by other serious problems. Militarily, he suffered a humiliating defeat to the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, losing territories his father had conquered. Administratively, he proved incompetent, allowing the royal treasury to be emptied. Politically, after Gaveston's death, he repeated the same mistake by elevating another favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, to a position of extraordinary power. The Despensers, Hugh, the father and son, effectively became the rulers of England, using their influence over the king to accumulate lands and wealth, crushing their enemies with executions and confiscations. Queen Isabella, now an adult and relegated to a secondary role, developed a deadly hatred for the Despensers and, by extension, for her own husband. The breaking point came in 1325, when Isabella was sent to France on a diplomatic mission. There, she refused to return as long as the Despensers remained in power. To make the situation even more explosive, the Queen became the lover of a powerful exiled baron, Roger Mortimer, who had escaped from the Tower of London and sworn to overthrow Edward and his favorites. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England. With a small army, to Edward's surprise, almost all the nobility and the people received them as liberators. The king and the Despensers fled westward but were captured. Hugh Despenser the Younger was subjected to a particularly brutal public execution. He was dragged by horses, hanged from a gallows 15 meters high, but removed before dying, castrated. His genitals burned before his eyes, disemboweled with his intestines, being removed and burned while he was still conscious, and finally beheaded. His head was displayed on London Bridge. ASF for Edward. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward II, in January 1327. Initially kept in relatively comfortable custody, he was transferred to Berkeley Castle in April of that year, under the guard of Thomas Berkeley and two men named John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney. The conditions of his imprisonment gradually deteriorated. According to accounts, he was deliberately kept in unsanitary conditions, forced to ride without pants to irritate his skin, and possibly subjected to psychological torture. The apparent goal was to induce him to die of natural causes, sparing Isabella and Mortimer the guilt of direct regicide. However, Edward proved surprisingly resilient. When it became clear that he would not die naturally as soon as desired, and with rumors of plans to rescue him beginning to circulate, a fatal decision seems to have been made. On September 21, 1327, Edward I was allegedly murdered. This is where we come to the crucial point of this story, what really happened that night at Berkeley Castle. The most well-known version, that of the red-hot iron inserted through a horn tube, first appeared in chronicles decades after the event. The most prominent of these sources is the Chronicle of Geoffrey le Baker, written around 1350, which describes in terrible detail how Edward was murdered in a way that left no external marks, but caused unbearable pain. Many modern historians, however, question this narrative. They point out that the hot iron story seems to have emerged as deliberate propaganda, possibly propagated during the reign of Edward II, who eventually executed Mortimer and imprisoned his own mother. The story would serve to further demonize his father's murderers, and, at the same time, make a symbolic connection between the method of execution and the king's supposed sexual activities. Some scholars argue that if Edward was indeed murdered, more conventional methods would have been more likely suffocation with pillows, for example, which would also leave no visible marks. Others go further and question whether Edward really died that night. An extraordinary alternative theory emerged in 1333, when a mysterious letter known as the Fieschi letter was delivered to King Edward III. In it, an Italian cleric named Manuel Fieschi claimed to have heard the confession of the real Edward I years after his supposed death. According to this account, the king had escaped from Berkeley Castle, while a porter's corpse was presented as his own. Edward then allegedly traveled through Europe, eventually becoming a hermit in Italy. This theory gained strength when, in 1338, a man called William the Welshman appeared at the court of the Holy Roman Empire in Koblenz, claiming to be Edward II. Most historians remain skeptical of these claims, but some respected scholars consider the possibility that Edward may have indeed survived. What we know for certain is that a royal funeral for Edward I was held in December 1327 at Gloucester Cathedral, where his elaborate tomb can still be visited today. The body, whoever it belonged to, was embalmed, which would have made it difficult to identify any trauma. Edward III, after taking power in 1330, executed Gurney and forced Maltravers into exile, blaming them for his father's death. The story of Edward III's brutal death, true or not, had a profound impact on English culture. Christopher Marlowe, in the late 16th century, based his play Edward II on these events, portraying the king as a tragic victim of his own passions and political cruelty. Although Marlowe does not explicitly describe the method of murder in the text, theatrical productions frequently include the scene with a red-hot iron, embedding it even more firmly in the popular imagination. The case of Edward III is particularly significant because it represents one of the first examples of formal deposition of a crowned English monarch. It established a dangerous precedent that would be followed in subsequent centuries, with Richard II, Henry VI, among others. The notion that a king could be removed from the throne by his own people fundamentally challenged medieval conceptions of royal authority derived from God. Moreover, the lasting association between Edward's sexuality and his tragic downfall established a narrative that would be repeated throughout history: the idea that transgressive sexual behaviors among rulers inevitably lead to political disaster. This persisted in European culture for centuries, affecting the representations of other monarchs, such as James I of England and Henry III of France. Regardless of how Edward I actually died, whether by the brutal red-hot iron, by more conventional means, or if perhaps he escaped to live a life of anonymity, his story remains one of the most dramatic examples of the potential consequences of the conflict between personal desire and royal duty, between individuality and the ruthless demands of medieval governance. Nearly 700 years later, Edward's tomb in Gloucester Cathedral still receives visitors fascinated by his tragic story. The eternal image, carved in his alabaster effigy, shows a serene and majestic king, with no indication of the torturous end that tradition attributes to him. This contrast between the stone dignity of the monument and the horror of the legend is perhaps the most fitting epilogue for a king whose life was defined by contradictions. A monarch who exercised absolute authority, but ended his days as the most powerless of men.